is a kind of fundamental idea. I thought about it as I was thinking about topics potentially for this week, and I was looking back over the many webinars that I've done over the year. This one popped out to me because I think, especially as of late, we've been talking about the idea of self, the idea of what is our role as a parent. And rather than focus on a specific diagnosis this evening, I wanted to talk about the idea of mental health and kind of the idea that transcends diagnoses. And what is our role both as therapists in that process and what is our role as parents in the process. So I want to talk about the value of context, both in terms of how it creates pathology, how it interacts with the self in order to create something that is not going well, it's not healthy, that's not okay. And then I also want to talk about how context can repair and make one whole. Of course, all of us, every human being comes with certain genetics. And then there's the environment. There's the given, what's been given to them, and then there's the made. And within that, and this is one of the oldest discussions in mental health, within that there are certain innate strengths, propensities, and vulnerabilities. And I've heard psychologists and therapists argue over the years about this idea that it's one or the other. Is it nature or nurture? And what almost everybody who's rationally thinking understands is that it's a little bit of both. I'm going to talk tonight about the idea that it's more valuable for us as parents to focus on the context because that's the only thing that we have control over. I think sometimes our search for the genetics, our search for the kind of the thing that came before we had anything to do with it, is a very intoxicating a search, because if we can find out that it's because of some genetic abnormality, maybe they were adopted, then it relieves us of our guilt and shame, our angst that we have over what we might have done to our children. But the fact of the matter is that there's another way. There's another way to look at our impact on our children without guilt and without shame. And through the process of enlightenment, through the process of shedding those judgments, we can become more honest with ourselves, more clear about our contribution, and then become more clear about our positive contribution. So regardless of what somebody comes with, the environment interacts with that and can create various diagnoses, various symptoms. Now, again, some people are going to be more vulnerable to certain kinds of stressors, certain kinds of trauma, but the fact of the matter is it's an exchange between the both, and that we can still look at our impact on our children, both positive and negative. Children grow up, people grow up through life, and they try to solve the issue of pain, right? The issue of their trauma. And like I always say, if we can allow ourselves to define trauma as anything less than ideal, it really, for us, broadens our idea, expands our acceptance of things. But again, that kind of frame requires us to do battle with our shame, right? We have to be able to willing to look at the trauma that we've inflicted on our children, the dents that we've made on our children. And then, of course, how human beings go about trying to protect themselves from pain wounds other people. And so then we experience trauma at the hands of our children. I haven't talked about this in a long time, but one of the early schools of family therapy, the family therapy movement, was at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, California. And with this group of psychologists, they were studying families in the home. And they were initially just there with the idea of observing. They eventually began to interact and began to intervene with the families. But initially it was just for observations. And what they observed over time was this phenomenon, that it wasn't the thing that happened to the family that caused the pathology, right? It wasn't the father losing a job. It wasn't the parent getting cancer. It wasn't the child's struggle of being cut from the football team. It wasn't or being bullied. It wasn't any of those stressors that were coming from the outside world. But it was how they went about trying to solve the problem. They called these attempted solution sequences. And so it is our attempt to try to solve the dilemma of life that becomes a symptom, right? It's how we cope with it. I heard something recently that was a really fascinating kind of side note. Somebody shared with me the idea that falling in love with another adult is falling in love with their dilemma for living, their dilemma with living. So this idea that all of us have a dilemma with living, with life, with pain, with discomfort, with our context. And it's our attempt to solve or to cope with it that reveals our symptoms. And all of us have certain inclinations, certain propensities, certain styles that we're born with. And so we organize those in a certain way. Like I said, falling in love with someone means falling in love with their dilemma with living. Right? And that's what we do. We ideally hold space for each other in that way. But going back to symptoms, we organize our symptoms. They create a certain kind of style, a pattern. And a pattern of defenses becomes predictable, cemented. And ultimately a diagnosis can be formed. And that's why, in fact, I've worked with clients as of late, couples as of late, who have dramatically different styles. Very, very different styles. But at the core are similar themes of shame, similar themes of boundary intrusions in their childhood. But their way out of them are dramatically different, how they got out of them. And a lot of times we just see it on the surface. Right? I've told this story before of two co-parents who approached me. I had separate phone calls with them at the beginning of our work together. And both warned me about the other. You know, the mother warning me that the father was a narcissistic, alcoholic, substance abuser, addict. And not to be fooled by his charm. And she offered to me this idea that she had documentation from therapists, psychologists, from lawyers even, that would support her position. And then, of course, talking to the co-parent, the father, he had a similar kind of story. This is a borderline mother with amazing amounts of anxiety. And that he too had psychologists and testing and lawyers that would testify to me that this was true about his ex-wife. And again, warning me not to be fooled by her story. And each of them at one point during our initial phone call asked me if I could see it in the other. Asked me if I wasn't fooled by their charms and I could see their diagnoses. And with both of them I answered the same way. I said, what I see is pain. What I see underneath it is pain. And yes, I can see, I can hear the pain. How they manifest themselves and how that gets organized into a certain pattern becomes really irrelevant in some ways. It does become irrelevant in terms of judgment, right? They're no better or worse than somebody with another diagnosis. So many times parents talk about their children. It's oftentimes around substance abuse and non-substance abuse issues. And they want to draw a really clear distinction between the two, assuming that one or the other is worse. But what we know in treatment and what your children will tell you as they heal and go through the process is they can relate to differences more easily as they go through the process. Right? They'll sit next to somebody who has dramatically different style at presenting symptomatically and say, I'm different with you in these small ways, in these small brushstrokes, but I'm the same at a core level. Trauma, we know, any kind of trauma changes the brain and can reduce access to reasoning, problem solving, and other characteristics that could help us cope in a healthy way. It changes the brain structure. It hijacks the brain. We don't think in rational, problem-solving ways with foresight. The trick in therapy, of course, is to look past the defenses. And remember this, one of the primary purposes of a defense, of a symptom, is to distract everybody from the wound. So in the case of eating disorders, if you focused on food and weight, you miss what's the pain, the original wound underneath. Same with substance abuse, same with cutting, same with any symptom that presents itself. Look beneath it. Try to find the story. And that requires, on the case of parents, a lot of capacity, because the first way in, the first step into, the doorway into the pain is to talk about the relationship between parent and child in many, many cases. So to not get distracted by the defenses is really important. And ultimately to find the wound, to find the story, and to learn to retell it to the client and to others in the family, to the treatment professionals, to the peers, to the school, to the setting. And then understanding what that story asks of everybody else. Your child was bullied, your child feels insecure, your child feels overwhelmed or erased by you. Your child felt unsafe in the family because there was so much anxiety or conflict. Your child felt inadequate because of the learning difference that they were born or predisposed to or with. And so what does that tell us? What does that require? What kind of support does that ask of everybody, of the context around them? What does that require of the parents? First and foremost, be slow to seek behavior change. Right? This is the primary, the first step in shifting between problem solving and developing a self. Many of us at times think about our children as a project, and the project is for them to get it right, for them to perform in a certain way. And while that is the outcome that we all seek, the way to get that is to focus on what's underneath. Trace it back. And that requires, again, the ability to contain. Following the trail of crumbs back home is the way that I like to think of it, to find the pain. In order for this to occur, there has to be a safe context. And that's the greatest gift that we can provide our children. That means that we manage our anxiety and our worry, our frustration, our disappointment, our anger. That we don't ask our children to contain that we don't give it to them, that we don't share it with them for the purpose of them being responsible for it. Remember, we allow it to inform us, but we don't let it to take over. We take that fear and anxiety and we go to professionals that we trust. We go to support groups. We read self-help books. We listen to podcasts or webinars to learn and be informed by it. We make that our project so that we can come back to the child with greater capacity, with more ability to respond, flexibility. Countertransference is our feeling toward the identified patient. In the case of a therapist, it's the therapist's feelings for the client. In the case of a parent, it's the feeling for our children. We can at least borrow that term from therapy. And some of it is diagnostic, right? Narcissism, for example, has a tendency to provoke a feeling from others of wanting to do battle with it, of wanting to knock it down to size, cut it off at the knees, show the narcissist their place, right? That's the instinct. But ironically, what narcissists need is to be seen and valued and understood. They need compassion and empathy, just like every disorder, really. But that's not our natural instinct. Some of this countertransference comes because diagnostically it's pulled out of us, and some of it comes because of our own personal history. We may have had a father or a mother with a similar style, and so we're prone and triggered to certain behaviors, to certain styles, to certain ways of presenting. And so part of what we need to do, and this is why I talk to clients all the time, if your therapist isn't in therapy or isn't in supervision, and my work is a kind of a blend of those two. If they're not in that, it's hard to trust them, because we can only get that perspective at times by talking to an outsider, someone else. Learning as a parent, as a therapist also, but as a parent to own what's yours. And learning to own your feelings. Doesn't matter if they come diagnostically or personally. It's still yours, right? If I want to rescue a depressed person, if I want to cut a narcissist down to size, if I think it's my job to soothe and manage the anxiety of my child, right? Even though those can be diagnostic and we can look at those, it still becomes my job to not respond unconsciously, right? Again, diagnostic countertransference can inform me, but I don't let it run the show. A lot of times when I'm doing supervision with my therapist, that's just what she'll point out. She'll say, that's very helpful. The way you've become entangled with this client tells us something about their story. Now that you know that, you can consciously decide to do something else with the process. So learning to own what's ours. But again, as parents, it's so threatening for us to own our part in the dance, our piece of this. Because we hold so highly this idea that we want to be a good parent. That we need to be a good parent to have worth. And because of that attachment to that ideal, we find it very, very difficult just to be human, just to be fallible, to be a screw-up sometimes or an idiot sometimes, right? But again, what it looks like when we embrace our own humanness is we don't need to defend ourselves, and we don't feel horrible about ourselves when we're able and capable of identifying the many ways that we mess up, screw up all the time. It's just matter of fact. It informs us, and that kind of, I guess it could be called humility, openness, enlightenment. That kind of enlightenment provides us the opportunity to first start in doing something better, doing something, responding in a more evolved manner with other human beings. I was reading an article that somebody passed on to me today about a certain diagnosis that I'd never heard of. It wasn't in the diagnostic manual, but some little small niche about how sensitive people were to other people's feelings, right? And they associated with ADHD. And at one point during the article, it was very fascinating. It was a very fascinating subcategory of diagnoses that I thought was a great illustration. And at one point, the author of the article said, but psychotherapy would not work with this. But then they went on to list the kind of medications that would have an impact on the individual. And I thought to myself, that's just not my experience, because I've had success with personality disorders, not in a 3 or 4 or 8 week program, but over the course of years. And I think what this person meant by psychotherapy doesn't work is it doesn't work immediately. It doesn't work in 2 months or 3 months or 6 months even. It would work over the course of years. This cementing of this pattern that began with most likely chronic trauma is not going to be erased in a 6-week course or in short-term therapy, brief therapy. But if the context over an extended period of time can be different than the one that one grew up in, it can absolutely change the brain in the same way. It takes a little bit longer than the original trauma, but it can happen. So it becomes our job to become aware of our thoughts and feelings and judgments, right? And that means therapy. I'm, of course, a fan of webinars. I'm a fan of podcasts. I'm a fan of books. All of those are a part of my own recovery process. But I can't find a substitute for therapy, right? It's something, speaking with somebody else, sitting on that other couch. There's just no substitute for that experience. Getting a response from a human being that is qualitatively different than the response that I've received from all of my other contexts is fundamental to healing. Like I said, with your feelings, learn your feelings, learn to kind of parse out what's going on for you. Don't ignore your feelings. It's not about not feeling anxious, but like I said, not being driven by them, and understanding that your anxiety is something that you have to take care of. Transference teaches us something, and working through what it is where the real work is. So the fact that we have these feelings isn't nothing. It can inform us, right? Being uncomfortable. A lot of people will talk about being intuitive. My experience with those people a lot is that they are feeling something, but they're not sure exactly what it is without a lot of work. It's imperative. It's almost the answer to every question. It's why I'm so proud of what we do and the list of people that show up every week. Doing your own work is almost the first answer to every question in parenting. And resolving and working with your own trauma increases your own capacity to access the rational parts of your brain. And if your first thought is, I don't have trauma, there's some work to do. We all have some. And the less we have, technically, the easier it should be to address it. But the fact of the matter is many of us have been enlisted in this idea that to discuss the trauma of our childhood would be a betrayal to our parents, that somehow we would need to apologize to them, or that we might be playing the victim or blaming. I can guarantee you that those messages of betrayal, of being the victim, of being a blamer, that those messages were in your original context, right? If you had a healthy, capable parent, they would have known that they were human, and they would have let you be angry and sad and disappointed in them. In fact, they would have been curious and interested in it often and supported it. What does it mean to join with or honor the defenses? It means to know that every defense that every person has, they come by it honestly, that it serves them some way. And that if we can look at defenses that way instead of with judgment or hatred or disgust or shame, then we can be a part of the healing process. But if we simply respond with hatred or shame or disgust, we're obviously not a safe person for them to express and explore themselves. And again, that's one of the gifts of the mental health frame. The Buddha said, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. And that concept applies to ourselves. Stuff doesn't go away just because we hate it. It goes deeper underground. It comes up somewhere else in the garden when we cut it off at the top. Some thoughts from Dr. Gill. Reasoning with stuck people. Since rational argument and learning won't work, what will? It would seem any improvement in the situation requires a direct experience of a different context. That is why transformation has such a significant history. Typically, when you learn something, the base does not shift. In a transformation, on the other hand, it is precisely the base that shifts. It is the nature of transformation that things are seen from a different angle. Also, the more pronounced the base shift, typically, the more profound the transformation. So, yes, we provide skills and tools. Absolutely. To you, to your children, that's absolutely part of what we do. But what we try to provide that is more impactful is for you to have a different experience, for your child to have a different experience. That's why the children in research attribute the greatest change, part of their program, to the field staff that live with them for 8 days in a row every other week. And it's this different context, these tree-hugging hippies that practice non-judgment and compassion and capacity that change your children. It's the therapist who walks into the field, ideally, when the student gets caught doing something or confesses to something either in their past or even in the current week. And the therapist just looks at them and says, yeah, that's how you are. Okay, now what? Instead of reacting with frustration, anger, disappointment. And that's why children describe their experience in wilderness, although it's much more strict, right? It's a much smaller box. That's why they experience it as a liberating time in their lives. How is therapy a new context? Part of the business of psychotherapy is to discover and create alternative experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. I'm going to read that again. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. What was automatic and unconscious is noticed and discussed. The world is allowed to become one of noticeable constructions. In other words, a couple of ideas. Nobody grows up in a normal home. And your truth wasn't the truth. It was a truth, but it wasn't the truth. That is why traveling to another country, to another culture, illuminates one's own. That's why building an orphanage in Central America for many people creates a dramatic shift. That's why hiking the Appalachian Trail. That's why going through a wilderness therapy experience. That's why going through psychoanalysis. That's why going to a therapeutic intensive illuminates one's own. That's why weeks and months and years of therapy illuminates one's own, because when we have a different experience, we begin to see that our experience wasn't the truth. It was just a made-up thing that was our family. And then we can become proactive, conscious, and choosing. And that takes work. It takes years and sometimes decades to make significant progress. Therapy and evoke therapy programs. The experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, what was very bad at home is now nothing. This difference in experience allows for the realization that things could be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. I think that's why the separation and the letter writing and the intentionality that can be in all of that can be so powerful, right? I think that's why families experience so much success in wilderness, is because you're responding through a matter of days, not over the phone or in person. Now, eventually, we're going to reintroduce the family back to each other so that you can practice in real time. But to separate, to slow it down, to write it down, to wait 3 and 4 days for responses, that can be a very powerful way to illuminate the constructs of our lives, both as children and parents. And then the reframing, the teaching that goes on in the weekly phone calls can help parents look at it through a different frame, right? That's what mental health therapy and theory can do for you. That's what understanding brain science can do for you. That's what understanding addiction science can do for you. It changes the base, right? You have a new view of it. And really that's what happens with the parents who, I don't know what it is all the time, honestly. Sometimes I think it's just luck. I think about my own adherence to therapy myself as luck. Because there were many times when I thought it wasn't working or thought it wasn't making a difference and was ready to give up. But somehow, for some reason, I kept coming until I saw it. It's a very similar experience to what so many of you tell me, that somewhere something just clicked and something changed for you. And sometimes we just get a taste of it. Sometimes we just get glimpses and get windows of it. So we know that it's out there. But sometimes we have to listen and re-listen and visit and revisit until we realize what's the difference. And then everything makes sense and comes into focus. I think that happens for children and for parents. We have to move away from objectification. Clearly, taking delight in an empathically emotional connection of self to self with the child is an entirely different thing from an outside to outside or a thing to thing connection. If connection is even appropriate here, that is, one is either a delightful person or is another object, such as a lamp. Right? What this frame that I'm describing, seeing the wound, does is it helps us to realize how human everybody is. That's why I'm so, even though I have a strong political bent, right? I definitely fit much farther on one side of the political binary that we now find ourselves in this culture. What I don't identify with is the anger and the hatred and the rage, even from my side, the judgment from my side. I identify with the passion. I identify with the mission of my own political stance. But what I don't identify with is the name calling and the rage. In fact, the only article I've written on this subject really was more critical of my particular political persuasion than the other side. Because that's the only side that I have some control, some influence on. So even when somebody is really seems to be a despicable human, this transformation that we're describing allows us to see the whole person. It's like what Thoreau said when he said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in every story suffering sufficient to disarm all hostility. In other words, if you could see people as whole, and what that requires is you to see yourself as whole. If we could see people as whole, we would have compassion instead of enmity and hatred and disgust and disdain. But again, that requires us to do battle with our own darkness. That's why therapy can be so helpful. That's why people say that after you've been in analysis, it's hard to talk to anybody who hasn't been in analysis. That's why Carl Jung said the best way to understand somebody else's darkness is to understand your own. Because then you can see whole people. And like Carl Jung said, I would rather be whole than good. So it's a two-way street. Hearing others. How many children experience adequate empathic resonance in connection with their parents? How many of us are heard, really heard, beyond superficial acquaintance? How many of us have a part of ourselves we are afraid to share? Twice in the last week, somebody has told me that when they first met me, first started talking to me, that they imagined their parents to be somewhat ideal. And in many ways, their parents have wonderful, wonderful attributes. But after they've done some work, they've realized to believe, to see, to understand how perfectly flawed their parents are and how liberating that experience is for them. And that realization doesn't move them, again, toward blame and victimhood. It moves them toward liberation. It moves them toward the liberty to be able to feel what they feel, to grieve what they need to grieve, to heal what is hurt and broken. Resiliency and hardiness. If people have experienced adequate empathic resonance as children in order to develop a secure sense of self, I've talked about that on the last two webinars, last two broadcasts. A secure sense of self and attachment pattern, they have an internal referent to rely upon in navigating daily dilemmas. In other words, they carry around a copy inside of themselves that they are okay. If, as so many, they have not developed an adequate and positive sense of self, it must be compensated for externally. We go about trying to prove to other people that we are good and worthy and okay. Thus, if one doesn't have an endoskeleton, one requires an exoskeleton. And that exoskeleton is what we call defenses and diagnoses. It's a pattern of coping with a lack of self, an empty self. It is what some psychologists call the false self. And it is the false self. As D.W. Winnicott says, it's the false self that brings the real self into therapy. And then we take the ultimate risk of eventually telling our therapist things that we were afraid if we told somebody again, if we showed up authentically again, we would receive the same reaction we've received in our past. The gift that you get. In this enterprise, it is easy to see that the more adept we are at functioning beyond our base, the more capable we will be in developing resonance with others. And that's really what our children are unconsciously pulling and asking us to do, is to get beyond our base, to stretch ourselves, to expand ourselves beyond what we were taught. It is critical that you cut the link between being good and being lovable, right? Knowing that you are good enough means knowing that you are flawed and knowing that you have darkness. You know, it's in the parent meeting where the parent said to me, so if I get you correctly, our challenges in parenting come from our childhood. And I couldn't help but laugh. Because yes, that's where it comes from. That's where it originates. Esteem comes from resonance from another person or entity, right? We think about self-esteem. It's similar to I'm not talking about pseudo self-esteem or pseudo confidence. I'm not even talking about confidence in a particular aspect of life. I have confidence in my job. That's not the same as esteem. I've seen incredibly talented people have confidence in their craft, in their art, but be dramatically, phenomenally insecure at a core level. Esteem is knowing that you're okay because you were seen. And when you were seen, you didn't frighten the other. You didn't disgust the other. You didn't worry or terrify the other. You didn't disappoint the other. They just saw you with understanding and compassion. Ultimately, in some contexts, this is called grace. And grace is what heals us. Just as I need external input to discover who I am, I need an external experience to allow me to see my original context with understanding. This requires me to seek difference. It is from the position of difference I will be able to see and begin to understand where I am for the first time. So what are the take-homes? It's the take-home of almost every broadcast. Do your own work. If you want to have a positive impact on your child, do your own work and don't make it short-term. Knowing what a trauma response is when you see it is really important. It doesn't go away, but you can begin to manage or make that your project. Like they say in Al-Anon, if it is hysterical, it is historical. Education can help, but only after a foundation in therapy is built, in parenting or in other things, right? Skills and tools are helpful, but outside of the context, they become somewhat empty. Focus on context over genetics. Focus on what you've done, most of all, more than anything else, since that's all you have control over. The brain, its structure and chemical makeup can change for better or for worse. While negative change can happen rather rapidly, positive change may take more time to heal, to reorganize. Your job is to support the development of a self, or just develop the sense of self. It's messy, nonlinear, crooked, and slow, but it is the treasure that you seek. Mental health, addiction, resilience, capacity, a passion for life, moral development, all of these things we seek for, we hope for in our children. All of these are embedded and tied to the sense of self. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions. Question number 1. Insight just today, not a question. I'm a bipolar mom. I thought I had to be a good mom, and that meant I thought my dyslexic and anxious son had to be successful at school. And because I was so sick, I could not deal emotionally with my son's increasing school failure and fear of failure. Of course, he could not heal my vast wound, not his job. No wonder he's a failure to launch young adult, hobbled by anxiety and poor self-concept. I just want to say something about you, because I know who you are, and I remember your comment from the other night. I believe you that you are quote-unquote sick, but I want to compliment you. If you're dealing with bipolar, if you've dealt with bipolar, if you've been sick, being able to acknowledge that the way that you do is a great, great gift to you, a credit to you, and a great gift to him. And for the rest of you, you need not be diagnosable to do the same thing. So thank you for that. My son has trauma. Next comment. My son has trauma, which I admit to not fully understanding. Sometimes when he tells me that a situation has triggered his trauma, as awful as it sounds, I feel like he's using his trauma to manipulate me. I've never told him how I feel because I'm sure if I'm right, it's my own traumatic response on his history of manipulation and lying. How can I tell? That's a great question. Let me tell you this. In some ways, it doesn't matter. In some ways, your response is independent of whether he's lying and manipulating. In other words, if one of my children comes in here and tells me, Dad, you're the worst father in the world. You never listen. You're always working, doing these webinars and other things. And their goal is to try to manipulate them, to give them more freedom, to feel sorry for them, to give in to some boundary, right? Or if they're being honest, that's really, at any level that they have access to, that's what they really feel. My response to both can still be empathic and understanding, and then to maintain clarity with my boundaries. So it's hard to explain, but I think about it in my marriage a lot. See, I feel manipulated by my wife when she's just telling me how she feels. I feel manipulated by my wife when she's trying to manipulate me. And I feel manipulated by her when she's doing some of both. So the fact of the matter is, I feel manipulated all the time. I feel manipulated when my daughter cries. I feel manipulated when my children express helplessness. I feel manipulated when my wife is anxious or sad. So for me to always know what they're doing becomes a very difficult project, right? So I just work on my side of it. So what I would say to you is, take it at face value. Respond to it curiously, empathically, genuinely, but then maintain strong boundaries. It only becomes a problem when that compromises you, right? Your boundaries, who you are. And so we codependents, and I suspect that speaks for many of us, we codependents will feel manipulated no matter what, even if the other person is giving an assertive I feel statement. I've coached and taught children and parents, for that matter, to give assertive, clear I feel statements, to write impact letters to the parents, hopes and intention letter to the children. And I have heard those on the receiving end of all of these letters that I deemed appropriately written, that they were trying to manipulate. Now, there's history that I wasn't privy to, right? There's a past that I wasn't privy to. So perhaps each of the recipients could say, I'm tying it to that context. But the fact of the matter is, it's not about whether or not they're manipulating you, it's about whether or not you're manipulated. And if we were, just imagine an ideal. If you were the perfect container, it wouldn't matter. Your response would be essentially the same. I'll tell you this, folks. Working with teenagers and young adults, I cannot tell you how many times I'm listening to what they say, thinking, there's like 13 layers deeper in this child than what they're saying right now. So I could bang them over the head with that or pry them open with a crowbar, but the fact of the matter, I just listen to it at the level that they're at. And I remain consistent with my boundaries, ideally. And then we get down layer after layer after layer. But if I challenge it, right, most likely I'm going to try to dismiss the feeling or argue or disregard it. Then regardless of what they were doing, they're going to feel not heard. They're going to feel not seen. They're going to have a case. And most likely, they're going to revert farther and farther into the hole. I'm going to go to the upcoming events, and then I'll have one more slide for questions at the end. We want all parents to attend 6 12-step support groups while your child is with us. We just want you to get exposed to them. You don't have to sign up for them forever, but we want you to know that they're there. They're free. Try to go and listen to what wisdom that you can hear from others. Try not to get caught up on the specific stories and examples, but what's the wisdom? What's the theme? What are you hearing? What's the meta message of those that are shared? You can go to NAMI.org to find out more information on that organization that can help you with classes and resources that are affordable in your area. You can listen to all these broadcasts on the podcast app on your iOS device or iPhone. Go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. On the Android device, download the SoundCloud app and you search Evoke Therapy Programs, or you can go to the soundcloud.com website on your computer and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. The Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook is an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy. So if you want to learn more about that or give back, go there. Go to our blog for new content, fresh content every week. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent is available on Amazon. You can also get an audio version of that through Amazon or through Audible. The next workshop that we want all current parents, if it's possible, if you can do it with your time and resources, to come to, is February 17th and 18th. There's still time for that. Sign up for that. You can also talk to your therapist and see if it's appropriate, timing-wise, clinically, for you to visit your child at the same time. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information. The next Finding You, if you want to do some of this deeper work, look into this trauma, change your base. The next Finding You, I don't think that's the right date. It says March 14th through 18th. Stephanie, let's check on that. If you could check on that on the website, Stephanie, open up a new window while I'm still reading this. I think that might be the wrong date. Come to Finding You. Finding Family is our custom family program that I run. You can go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. Parent support groups, the ones that we have so far on the schedule, I'll be in Los Angeles area, Sunday, February 11th, 4 to 5 potluck, Sunday so that you can avoid traffic, and 5 to 7 parent meeting. I'll be in New York City on March 20th. Seattle, we will be there on March 31st, and Portland on April 28th. Upcoming soon is Connecticut, New Jersey, Toronto, and the Bay Area. Andrea at evoketherapy.com for more information. Pursuits trips are sober fun, therapy light, family or young adults, adventure trips with our staff. It's March 7th through 11th, so let's fix that on the slide for next time. March 7th through 11th. Finding You is March 7th through 11th, not as it's listed here, the 14th or the 18th. March 7th through 11th. All right, any other questions? One last question. The Evoke experience has profoundly affected me as a father, and I'll be forever thankful. I'm very, very grateful. It's affected me also. Another question. My 27-year-old son was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit disorder, bipolar, and now borderline personality disorder. In therapy, I'm now feeling responsible for where he is in his life and regret that none of the endless counselors, psychiatrists, and therapists ever helped me understand before I feel so much damage has been done, so much conflict and blame. His sadness and anger are directed at me, and I understand why. Have you seen true forgiveness and healing with an adult child? Absolutely. This is for me, my best example of this. I want to say something first. I suspect, I don't know this for sure, and maybe this is me speaking about something I don't know, but I think a reason a lot of therapists don't know to go there with you is they haven't done their own work. They're educated and intelligent, and some of them are gifted academically, but they haven't done their own work. And I can't emphasize that enough. Like Carl Jung said, and he wasn't just spouting some philosophy. To understand somebody's own darkness, you have to come to know your own. So that's the first thought that I have. The best example that I can give you is my own mother. My own mother, 20, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, when I first had children, I would have told you if you had asked me that my mother was average and that my father was average. I would have talked about their strengths and deficits and said they were essentially a product of their time. I had no illusions that they were perfect, but I thought that they were typical. 25 years later, sitting here now, I can see dramatically how compromised both of my parents were. I can see their diagnosis. I can see the harm that they did to us. I will tell you this right now. I love my mother now much more than I loved her when I was 25 years old, because of the work I've done as a parent educator, and being a client. So absolutely, it's the human condition. I wrote a blog, in fact, if you go to the Evoke Therapy blog, I wrote a blog called Will My Child Forgive Me? Just go to my name and then search my blog. And it talks about this. People forgive people when they get healthy. I've seen children forgive parents who were dramatically, acutely abusive. I've seen children forgive parents whose parents went to jail for their abuse. So yes, that's what we do. But the work that we do as parents to show up and to be accountable, to make amends, we do that as a gift. We do it without the expectation for forgiveness. We do it not to be forgiven. We do it to unburden the child. And the gift that often comes back is their forgiveness. But we don't do it to be forgiven. If we do it to be forgiven, we're really just doing more of what has been done, right? We're trying to be good again. All right, next question. Then your comment begs the question, can I forgive my child? Of course you can. It's the same thing. Yeah. It's hard sometimes because I think in some ways we have more expectations about our children than we do about our parents, right? We have more dreams for our children than we do our parents. We have a life that we wanted with them, right? That we saw as really our life. And when that gets crushed or ripped away from us because a child struggles with mental health or addiction, we absolutely then are injured and wounded by it. But yes, we can forgive them also. All right, that was the last question. Thanks, folks. Thanks for your participation. Thanks for attending. I hope this is a helpful point of contact for and on behalf of your children. I thank you for making this effort. I'm going to be traveling all next week, running an intensive and in Los Angeles visiting professionals. So I won't do any live broadcast next week. So the next one will be Wednesday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll come up with a title and a topic for you then. Have a great week while I'm gone. Take care. Watch some of the other broadcasts or listen to some of the other podcasts or take a vacation. Have a great week, folks. Thank you. Bye-bye.